My name is Court Tompkins. I'm CTO here at IP Configure, and Orchid 23.9 was released several weeks ago. So it's been out for a little bit now, and we're going to do a brief webinar on all of the new features that are in that version. So a little bit of review to start with. Recall that Orchid VMS has a couple of different components and a couple of different brands. So what we're talking about here will apply to Orchid Core, Orchid Fusion, Orchid Hybrid, and Orchid Alto. So as a refresher, we're going to begin by talking about Orchid Core VMS. That is our recording server. The features that we talk about in Orchid Core VMS will also apply to Orchid Fusion, Hybrid, and Alto. Those are our management level applications. So if you have an installation with multiple sites, you'll use the management server to pull all of your recording servers together. So first, again, we'll talk about what's new in Orchid Core. Those features are available both on the NVR itself as well as at the enterprise level. Then we'll talk about the enterprise only features that are new in Orchid 23.9. All right, so starting off with Orchid Core 23.9 features. One of the big new enhancements in Orchid Core 23.9 is we have improved our event system. So if you recall, in our 23.6 release, we introduced an events mechanism in Orchid where we can associate third-party events, either from ONVIF metadata or from external systems using webhooks. We can associate those events with video in Orchid. This is a feature that we plan to iterate on consistently over time and have small enhancements with each release. And with this 23.9 release, we have improved the way that you can filter and search those events. So we now have the ability to search events based on the camera name and the event name, as well as just the event category. So I will, let's see, pull a demo over here onto my screen so everybody can see it. So right now we're looking at all of the events on an Orchid server, but now I can do some additional filtering. So let's say, for example, I'm only interested in events that happened, let's say before 12:55 p.m. today. I can filter by event state. So this is, for example, I only want to know when the event went active. So this means I only want to know when motion started. I don't want to know when motion stopped. And let's say I also am only interested in events called, I know I've got an event in this system, sort of an elegantly labeled motion test. So I've now got a pretty complex filter. I can hit search, and now I'm only looking at events based on those filters. So in the previous release, we could only filter by category. We're now sort of being able to filter on the entire event. So time and date ranges, camera names, the event name, etc. All right, so that is, again, one of those incremental event features in Orchid 23.9 as we work on extending our event system. We also now have the ability to dynamically reload SSL and TLS certificates in Orchid Core VMS. This is sort of a back-end technical thing, but if you're managing a lot of Orchid Core servers, this is an important feature. Most folks are deploying SSL certificates now from Let's Encrypt, sort of a free online service for issuing SSL certificates. Those certificates are only valid for 90 days, so you're refreshing them pretty frequently. Before 23.9, you had to restart the Orchid Core recording server in order to use your new SSL certificate. That process might only take a minute. It's not a particularly long time, but you're not recording while the server is restarting. Again, beginning now in this release, we can refresh our SSL and TLS certificates without having to restart the service, without having any downtime. All right. And then one last thing that's going on in Orchid Core VMS is we've got a lot of behind the scenes changes in the recording server to support an upcoming audit logging feature that'll be available in our next release. So beginning with this release, Orchid Core is now gathering a lot of audit logging information. Within 23.9, that data is not accessible. You can't actually get to it, but it's the building block of this audit logging feature that we'll talk about in our next release webinar for the 23.12 release. All right, so now moving on to Orchid Hybrid, Orchid Fusion, and Orchid Alto 23.9. Again, these are our enterprise applications. If you've got an Orchid installation that's managing multiple locations, multiple sites, multiple servers, you'll be using this enterprise interface, and that's where the majority of the new features are for our 23.9 release. So the big new feature in 23.9 is we now support SAML for single sign-on. So Orchid has supported a number of single sign-on mechanisms for years now, but SAML is new in this release. So previously we supported Active Directory, Microsoft Azure AD, Google Workspace, and a system called FreeIPA, just sort of an open source version of Active Directory. Those were all specific integrations for specific single sign-on providers. The benefit of SAML is that it is a broad standard that any single sign-on provider can support. And as long as your single sign-on provider supports SAML, which almost all of them do, we can use that single sign-on mechanism to log into Orchid using this SAML standard. So if you're sort of familiar with enterprise IT, you know this. But for those of us who aren't, we've got the motivation here. Increasingly, enterprise organizations are using standalone single sign-on providers that integrate with their applications using SAML. So historically, single sign-on would be done with something like Active Directory that's sort of tied to some existing IT infrastructure. Increasingly, we see folks who want to use an independent single sign-on provider to get access to multiple systems. Active Directory, again, is sort of the legacy single sign-on mechanism for a lot of enterprises. Active Directory doesn't play well with cloud applications. It's not really designed to be exposed to the internet. So a standalone single sign-on provider addresses that need. Okay, so the way SAML works in Orchid, and again, this is SAML 2.0, which is the current standard, is that in my single sign-on identity provider, that's where I go to manage all of my users and their rights and roles in my organization, I would create a group within that SAML system. All of the users who I want to have access to Orchid, I would add to that group, and then I can then set permissions for that group within the Orchid hybrid interface. So here is an example I will show you where we would go to do that. If you've configured Microsoft Azure or Active Directory or FreeIPA in Orchid VMS, these SAML identity providers work the same way. So let's see, I will go to a group here on the permissions page. So we'll go to our viewer group, and I will edit this group, and you see I have this external mapping where I am giving permissions to the ipconfigure.com domain, and the group within that domain is Orchid Hybrid Viewers. So this is a system where I've set up Google Workspace through SAML, gone into my hybrid properties files, added some keys and tokens that I need for SAML in there. I've named that SAML provider ipconfigure.com, and within my Google Workspace admin interface, I have a group called Orchid Hybrid Viewers, and any user in my organization that I want to have view access to this hybrid site, I can add to the Orchid Hybrid Viewers group within the Google Workspace admin interface, and they get the permissions that I've defined here. So it's a great way for managing access to a large number of users. It's all group-based. I define my groups in my identity provider, and then I give that group access to Orchid Fusion and define their permissions, their specific permissions within the Fusion interface. So we've tested our SAML integration against a number of different single sign-on providers. These are the ones that we used for our initial testing. This is not an exhaustive list. SAML is a standard, so as long as your identity provider supports SAML, should work with Orchid. But the ones that we have validated are Auth0, Okta, Ping, Azure Active Directory, which is in the process of being renamed, I believe, to Microsoft Intra ID, as well as Google Workspace. There's plenty of other identity providers out there, CyberArk and a bunch of others. They all support SAML. They'll all work with Orchid as well. So yeah, just to again summarize the benefits of SAML or single sign-on in general, large enterprises would use SAML because they want one set of credentials for all their applications. They want to be able to manage those credentials centrally. A single sign-on provider who support SAML will often give you much better enforcement of policies like password rotation, complexity, and two-factor authentication through a bunch of mechanisms. Your single sign-on identity provider provides those security security features, and then you sort of get those automatically through Orchid Hybrid by linking up Orchid Hybrid to your SAML identity provider. But it also allows you to decouple single sign-on from unrelated IT infrastructure. And again, traditionally you might have used something like Active Directory or Google Workspace for single sign-on, but those are sort of tied to other applications within your enterprise. And increasingly, organizations are interested in using a completely independent identity provider like Auth0 or Ping. I will note that a couple of these identity providers are supported or have been supported in Orchid and still are through direct integration. So we do have a direct integration where we can add support to Google Workspace and Microsoft Azure AD. Those continue to work, but now in addition to those legacy integrations where I specifically configure Google Workspace or Azure AD, I can now also set those systems up as SAML single sign-on. And they'll work the exact same way, but there's one big advantage to setting up Google Workspace and Azure Active Directory through SAML, and that is the Orchid VMS mobile app. So the Orchid VMS mobile app now supports single sign-on as long as you're using one of these SAML single sign-on providers. So as a reminder, our direct Microsoft Azure and Google Workspace integrations do not support single sign-on while you're using the app. But happily, either of those systems can be configured in Orchid Hybrid using SAML. So as long as you've configured these using SAML, you'll get single sign-on in the mobile app. One other important thing to mention is that we do support multiple SAML single sign-on providers. I believe we can configure up to 5. That's in our documentation. There'll be links to that at the end. So up to 5 single sign-on providers that you can configure in a single Orchid system. That's useful for big enterprise users. Maybe the canonical use case might be something like a school system where the school system has a single sign-on provider for their staff, but maybe the police department uses a separate single sign-on system. So with our new SAML feature, I can define multiple SAML single sign-on providers for a single system and give multiple organizations access through single sign-on. All right, so a few more small but important changes in this Orchid Hybrid Fusion and Alto 23.9 release. The first of those small changes revolves around the Orchid VMS library. So if you recall, the library is where we can export footage from a recording server to a library that lives on the management server, and the footage that's been exported to that library basically lives there forever. It gets pulled out of the normal delete cycle on the recording server where it will eventually go away based on your retention rules. Once video is in the library, it's kept there forever until you delete it. The library also makes it relatively easy for me to share video with outside parties. Up until Orchid 23.9, the only users who could view or add video to the library were administrators. But with 23.9, we can now give non-administrative users access to view and add video to the library. So this is the permission groups page where I define rights and roles for users or groups. And you'll see here that we now have a toggle for library access. So I can now give somebody library access without making them an administrator. So it's been a requested feature and one we got into this 23.9 release. Another enterprise feature that we've gotten a number of requests for over the last few months and that we've added in 23.9 is we can now change the way we send out health alerts from Orchid Fusion. So these health alerts, these are the alerts that you can configure and have sent out when something like a camera goes down, storage becomes degraded, a recording server goes offline. So up until this release, those emails were always batched together. So multiple issues, if they happened around the same time, would be put into one email. So let's say if I had a big enterprise and maybe 10 different cameras went down over a 5-minute window, I would get one email that listed all 10 of those servers with all 10, all of those cameras all bundled up into a single email. If you're an administrator who's sort of looking at those emails and acting on them, single email is convenient, But we are seeing a lot of enterprise users who want these Orchid health alerts to be sent into a ticket system so that each individual problem will automatically have a ticket generated, and then the help desk can go through and knock out each one of those issues independently. So now when I go to configure my Orchid VMS health alerts, there is an additional toggle on the configuration page where I can choose to either enable or disable the consolidation of multiple trigger events into a single email. So if I'm want to pump these email alerts into a ticket system or a help desk system, I untoggle that so every individual issue gets its own email, and it can become its own ticket. All right. So that is it. That was everything that was new in Orchid 23.9. So again, in Orchid VMS, we've got some incremental improvements to the way we handle events, making them a little easier to search and filter through. We have the SSL changes. And then Orchid Fusion, that was the big new feature for this release. Fusion, Hybrid, and Alto received SAML single sign-on support, as well as improvements to the library and the health alert emails. All right, so if you want to dig any deeper on these features, we do have training resources, training.ipconfigure.com. We've got manuals that'll tell you how to configure all of this stuff at manuals.ipconfigure.com. And if you have any questions about anything you've heard or issues with your Orchid system or just want to know more about how to use it better, we've got a help desk at support.ipconfigure.com, also a helpline listed on that site that you can call. All right. So that is all I've got. I don't see anything in the Q&A, so thank you everybody for attending. This webinar was recorded, and we will share that with everyone shortly. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.